Part 1. I found out about my grandpa's 1950s homosexual love story through his love letters. Our grandpas were dying, and all of us were busy playing politics. Edwin's voice was loud and irritated, even dejected when he exclaimed, "It sucks to be a part of the family. After everything He stopped and corrected himself. After everything they've done. We're here to stay with them? Are we a bloody joke?" Edwin has been ranting for the past 10 minutes. If I didn't reciprocate his feelings, I seriously would have asked him to shut his mouth. There was only so much I could hear about my grandpa. But the truth was that I shared the same feelings for my grandpa, Adam. Granted, most of the feelings harbored from secondhand embarrassment my family provided me, but those were feelings nevertheless, and I had the right to feel. As I listened to Edwin rant, I knew his life was built with similar stories. Our families had been living in the same city for the past 10 years. There was no relation between us but the mutual past that our parents seemed to share. That was the only reason Edwin and I came to know each other. That was the reason it took us merely half an hour to rekindle that friendship. 2 weeks ago, our families received emails from Adam and Evan, Edwin's grandpa. In the emails, both the men confessed that they were dying and they wanted to meet their families for the last time. They asked us to meet at their home, which wasn't exactly a home considering how huge it was, so that we could clear our differences before they died. Our parents announced they'd come later. They sent Edwin and me here first. That was why we were here, sitting on this giant stone and overlooking the vastness ahead of us. Nights in the towns came quicker than they did in the cities, and it was way too silent here now. At some point, I was sure Edwin and I were the only two souls awake here. Everyone had gone to sleep. "I kind of feel guilty about earlier," I confessed, my voice tinier than I intended it to be. I played with my fingers and avoided looking at Edwin. I knew his eyes were boring holes into my face, and the very thought of that brought color to my cheeks. Edwin was a handsome man, and my parents could sue me for admitting I liked looking at him more than I should. If he gave me attention, I was sure to feel nervous. But I don't know how to stop it. I feel so irritated around him. I do too, but I try my best to never say stuff to my grandpa's face. I slapped his arm with a small whine and he laughed. Previous irritation all forgotten. "God, you're making me feel worse." I'd arrived at my parents' place late afternoon. Although he'd greeted me with a warm, welcoming smile, I couldn't move past the sentence my mom had told me before I left for the town. "Anthony, always remember your granny died because of him." The words were so upsetting that I snapped at him and said some words that I knew I shouldn't have. I didn't have the right to go above and beyond with my hate. "No, your words just prove that you're safe." I stared back at him, a little confused. "What's that mean?" He pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket and offered it to me. "What is it?" I dared not open it. Even though I wasn't an expert, I knew the paper was old. It looked worn out and I could see several places it had been torn at. It looked like if I made one wrong move, it would fall apart in my hands. "Edwin?" Edwin visibly swallowed. "I was in the basement. My grandpa asked me to bring a candle holder, something about it being very precious to him, and while searching for that, I found that." He pointed at the paper. I don't even know what to say, Anthony," he admitted, and his expression looked partly confused and partly exasperated. "I couldn't finish it. I want you to read it with me, Anthony." I couldn't help but look at him. "What is it, Edwin?" And this time his voice came a little brittle. "It's a letter. From your grandpa to mine. Sometime later." There were 2 reasons we had to wait to read the letter. First, it was late at night and there wasn't enough light for us to read it, and reading it under our phones' flashlights didn't really sound like a comfortable idea. Second, Edwin claimed that we needed to be settled comfortably first to read through the letter. He claimed that it contained something that he was pretty sure none of us had seen coming. So, we had to walk back to our grandpa's house for the next 21 minutes. In those minutes, Edwin asked if I had ever wondered why our grandpas were living together. "Probably best friends," I replied, a little annoyed that he wasn't telling me what he'd read. "Are you one of those historians who erase any trace of homosexual love in ancient beings?" "Oh, go to hell," I replied, blushing a little at the thought that he could be calling me a homophobe of all things. I was a gay man. I had a crush on Edwin, and I wasn't denying it to myself. Sure, I wasn't going to tell him either, but I got the point across. "I feel like our grandpas have more history than we initially thought," he mused. "I mean, that's probably why they're living together. And dying together," he added with a small smile. When we reached, Edwin's grandpa, Evan, was still awake. When he saw us, he gave us a long sigh and shook his head disapprovingly. "Boys," he said, "I've told you already, do not leave the house at night. It's not safe out there. You could get hurt by wild animals or worse." "Okay," Edwin replied and dragged me out of sight. When we were out of his sight, he huffed. "God, looking at him gives me a headache. It's embarrassing he can still show his face. Why don't you say these things to his face?" His hand was still wrapped around my wrist, and I was trying very hard to not pay it any attention. "I don't want to hurt him," he replied, a little guiltily. "My parents have done that enough." Which, okay, made a lot of sense. My parents had also done their part by dragging the absolute hell out of my grandpa. Something that both hurt me and upset me, but I never dared to say anything back to my parents with the belief that they understood my grandpa better than I did. Same, I agreed, even though sometimes I still end up saying bad things. You're not a bad person, Anthony, Edwin said. Your feelings are valid. After all, our grandpas have hurt our grannies. It only makes sense we hate them. I nodded and followed him into the bedroom we were supposed to share. He locked the door behind us and we settled on the bed, our backs against the headboard. He asked me to hold the letter, as your hands are a lot smaller than mine. When I glared at him, he gave a small giggle, not at all suitable to his age and his gangly limbs, and defended himself. It's the truth, and we have to make sure we don't damage it anymore. Right, I replied and rolled my eyes. I worked on the letter a little delicately. It was indeed torn in all the places, and the creases looked like they were part of the structure itself. There was no doubt that the letter was decades old. As Edwin said with bated breath next to me, I couldn't deny my own nervousness. It was almost like unraveling the history. And true to my suspicion, the letter belonged to the late 1940s. Our grandpas were young at that time, probably in their late teens, I guessed. I looked at Edwin for a brief second before we began reading. Dear Eve, I hope this letter finds you well. I would have tried to maintain my decorum, but you and I are well aware I am anything but sane in your presence. So I will not try to act like a decent man because I am everything but. I have missed you dearly. Ever since I saw you 2 weeks ago, I have done nothing but long for you. I'm desperate for your— I stopped, blushing furiously. I am not reading this, I declared and placed it in Edwin's open palm. What are the chances it was directed at your granddad? I asked. The name in the salutation read Eve, and I was perfectly sure Edwin's granddad was called Evan. It's probably smudged, he replied, but it's definitely Evan. Unlike me, Edwin looked like he had no shame. He continued reading the letter in my presence, loudly exclaiming sentences that he was sure I would like. And it was incredibly flattering. Some of the sentences looked like they belonged to a romance novel or an erotica. Coming from Edwin's mouth, they sounded like love declaration. I tried to separate my own crush on him from the words he was reading. The words belonged to my grandpa. He had written it. His words sounded so desperate. It was as if he were a wife waiting on her husband who'd gone to serve in the war. The comparison sounded so bizarre, I couldn't help but wonder how little I knew him. Why are you still reading it? It's wrong. We need to know, he replied and delicately put the letter in one of his books. Well, it at least proves they were anything but friends. I can't help but think how miserable it all would have been, Edwin said and looked up at the ceiling. I lay on the bed and looked at him curiously. They probably sneaked around a lot. The past was homophobic as hell. I feel sorry for them, I added. But that still doesn't mean they can go on and cheat on our grannies. That's something even gays aren't allowed to do. Edwin gave a small laugh. No one is, he agreed. Do you wonder how they looked younger? I shrugged. I once saw my grandpa's picture. He looked like you and me, thin and clean-shaved. He had hair. I gave a small laugh. Do you reckon there are any pictures of them on the walls? Should we check? I asked, and he eagerly nodded. I grabbed my phone and we tiptoed to the living room, hoping that some of the pictures were of their younger versions. We knew better than to switch on the lights, so all we had was the flashlight. God knew better than us that we could have done this in the morning, too, but curiosity always killed the cat. Or whatever. Because he was a few inches taller than me, Edwin grabbed my phone and started looking at the frames. Most of them were their newer pictures, probably when they were in their 50s or 60s, and a lot of them were ours. Eventually, Edwin pointed at a particular one. That's black and white. They look like young babies, he whispered and grabbed the frame from the wall to show it to me. Probably in their early 20s, I said. Edwin nodded, but before he could reply, someone cleared their throat behind us. We jumped, and Edwin hid the frame behind his broad frame. It was my grandpa, Anthony. Boys, I know you're too old to have a bedtime, but it's past your bedtime. Edwin and I were sweating bullets. We couldn't sleep, Grandpa, I replied, pushing Edwin behind me. Edwin and you are helping us cook tomorrow morning, boys. Go to sleep right away. 5 minutes? I begged. Anthony, bed, now. I huffed, and we started dragging ourselves from there. Edwin, please put the frame back in its place, son. Evan and I are too old to put it back. Edwin violently nodded and did so. The next morning. Do you think that's it? That was the first thing I heard when I woke up the following morning. Edwin was shirtless and standing in front of the window, his hands crossed behind his back as if he were some great sage. The comparison sounded a little weird, mostly because I had not a single decent thought in my head about him. What do you mean? I asked and turned around on my bed. Edwin's bed was made, and he probably had his lovely morning jogging that he often boasted about. Do you reckon we'll find other stuff about that? I was immediately reminded of the letter sitting in one of his books. I don't know. Look, it's pure luck that you found the letter. It was a love letter. Quite explicit at that. I'm surprised that my grandpa took such a dangerous step, but I stopped and sat up in my bed. I don't assume that they have their love letters lying about the house for us to find out. What if they do? He asked, and I heard him turning around. When I looked back, he was leaning against the windowsill, his arms crossed over his broad chest. Remember what our grandpa said in the emails? They wanted to make amends. They want to make things right between the families, Anthony. What if this is the way? Going through their personal love letters? Heck no. Reading one erotic letter was enough for me to last a lifetime. I didn't want to go through that trauma again. I know it's disrespecting their privacy, but what if it's the only way of finding out the truth? Truth about what, Edwin? I asked and turned to him. If they were actually as mean as our parents claim. Just then, a knock came on the door, and Edwin's granddad announced his presence. "Boys," he said, "I'm ashamed to say this as you two are our guests, but Adam insists I ask for your help. He doesn't trust me in the kitchen anymore. Well, not after that little accident. Would you be kind enough to help cook some breakfast?" Edwin and I looked at each other. When he didn't reply anything, I cleared my throat and told Evan that we would be downstairs in 5 minutes. We heard a small thank you and heard his steps down the creaky stairs. When I turned to Edwin again, he looked like he was in deep thought. "What?" I asked. "Do you understand how it looked when you answered like that?" I furrowed my eyebrows. "What?" "Like we're a married couple," he answered bluntly and without an ounce of humor. Even I knew my aim was better when I threw a cushion at him and it didn't hit him. It was Edwin who first asked Evan anything related to their affair. "Since when are you guys living together?" He was making omelets and I was standing next to him, making sure he didn't burn himself. He looked like he was good at cooking, but a disaster at keeping things clean and himself safe. Besides, I was pretty sure he was distracted. His fingers often shook when either Adam or Evan hummed. Because, it's fascinating. You two together and the rest of the family far away. The reply came late. "From the late 70s, I think." It was my grandpa, and his voice sounded so frail that it brought tears to my eyes. "Time did that to you." "What do you think, Evan?" "It was definitely 70s. "You were still married to our grannies," Edwin answered. The silence followed by his statement was only broken by the shrill ringtone of my phone. I gave a warning look to Edwin and hurried to the living room to check the caller ID. It was my dad. Obviously, it was him. Since yesterday, he'd called me non-stop, probably to remind me over and over again to not get too close to my grandpa because he's a bad person, Anthony. You must understand that. When I picked up the call, that was the first thing he said to me. "I know, Dad," I replied and closed the door after me. "Has either of them said anything to you?" he asked then. I shook my head and then realized that he couldn't see it. "No," I answered verbally. "But Dad, I wanted to ask something." I stopped and my dad stopped on the other side. I knew he was listening very intently. "Grandpa divorced Nana in the late 70s, right?" "Yes." The reply was instant. "All for that other guy." He spat the word. "And can you believe, Anthony? Your Nana was incredibly sick then. He left her dying. In the same year, they adopted a kid. And although I consider this cruel to say, but the kid died soon after. Thank God. Those two deserve that. Stay away from them, kid. They're never good news." This was new information. I'd never heard him talk about a kid before. In the evening, when I told Edwin about it, he furrowed his eyebrows and looked deep in thought. "That doesn't make sense," he replied. "My mom never told me that. In fact, I remember her telling me that our granddads had decided to not adopt any kids and thus chose to focus on themselves. She called them selfish for that, but we know how she never liked them together." He shrugged. "Then why did my dad tell me that?" I asked as if he could answer. "Why did he lie?" Neither of us had the answer to that question. As we walked, we came across a shop. An elderly man was struggling to close the lock, probably because the lights were out. Edwin and I looked at each other and then approached him. He looked up at us before we reached him. Damn, he had good hearing. "Sorry, kids, the shop's closed." "No, sir, we're not here for that." Edwin stopped and pointed at the door. "Can we help?" "Oh, thank you. Thank you." He stepped aside and handed the keys to Edwin. I stood at a little distance, my hands demurely crossed in front of me as the old man assessed me. He asked if we were from Adams and Evan's place. Edwin answered for me and confirmed his suspicion. He handed the man the keys again. "I knew it!" he exclaimed. "You kids look like them." By now we had walked quite a distance. "How come you two never visit those two oftener? You know they're dying, right?" The question made us feel guilty and we blushed in shame. "Oh, don't be embarrassed. We're all aware of your family feud." As he walked alongside us, Edwin and I realized that he was a walking disaster. We had to make sure he didn't fall in the dark. "But trust me, those two aren't as bad as you guys believe. I've known them for the past 40 years. I know more than your parents do." Edwin and I looked at each other. This sounded like an opportunity. even though we had zero idea about his relations to either of our granddads. Edwin cleared his throat, and before the man could enter his home, he asked if he could tell us something. The old man asked him to go on. "Can you tell us something about our granddads? Like, did they ever have a kid?" The old man looked a little confused and then shook his head. "Never. They had your fathers from their previous marriages. It still upsets me that none of your family members attended their wedding." He shook his head in disapproval. "Whose?" I asked. "Your granddads. They cried a lot. I remember asking them why, and they said they were happy that they were legally husbands, but we were sure it was because none of you showed up." We hadn't known of their marriage. It seemed to change the entire narrative we so far believed in. "We didn't know about that," I muttered, but the old man never replied anything. Something like shame seemed to drape both Edwin and me from then on. He pointed at a distance. "There, they married there. I still remember it because it was such a scandalous thing to do, but who doesn't like free food? Most of the townspeople were there." He gave a small laugh and gave us hints of a place where he promised the wedding happened. He said we were sure to notice some things from that day. "Adam and Evan had scratched their names on a goddamn tree like two fools in love. It was such a sappy affair," he added at last. The way he talked seemed to thaw something in both of us. Although we knew it was late and our granddads were sure to get upset, we dragged ourselves to the spot to check out the place ourselves. When we reached it, we immediately looked for the tree. It was dark, and our only support was the flashlight. I had left my phone at home, so Edwin's phone was the only solution for us. We were walking in the dark, so it wasn't a surprise when I stumbled a little and he grabbed me around my waist to keep me on my feet. "Careful," he muttered, unaware of the blush on my cheeks. Thanks," I replied and tried to pull myself away, but he shook his head and grabbed my hand. "So that you don't fall and break your pretty face," he added. I wanted to punch him, but I was too busy blushing at the compliment. When we found the tree, we both rubbed our fingers over our granddad's names. The names were enclosed in a little heart. "Turns out, nature never forgets," I murmured. Edwin hummed and took a picture of it. A few days later, "What do you reckon we should do?" Edwin asked on one of the following days. We'd spent our previous few days on looking for clues or any other letters from that time. So far, we'd only found a single black and white photo of our granddads, and we were sure that wasn't going to help us. On top of all that, my granddad's health was deteriorating at a rapid pace. Each time either of us called our parents to come quickly, they made some sorry excuse and promised that they'd come the moment they got the chance. This made us both guilty and ashamed. The more we lived with our granddads, the less sense our parents made. On one of the days, I called my dad to ask him about our granddad's marriage, and his reply was so hateful that for a moment, I felt like I hadn't known my dad at all. "It was a shameful act, Anthony. None of the family members wanted to be part of such shame. Two men marrying? It was a shameless behavior. None of us attended," he said. I couldn't understand what was so shameful about it. I was gay, and the very thought that my parents would say the same thing about me seemed to both upset me and scare me. Even so, I held back my tears and tried to change the subject. I didn't want to get disappointed in my dad. "But Dad, they waited for you. I met an old man here and he said that they waited for us to come. We never came. Why didn't you tell me?" "They waited for us, Dad. They must have been so hurt." This silenced him. "Anthony, do you want me to bring you back here?" Angry and upset, I hung up on him. Edwin was still looking at that old letter and repeated his earlier question. "I don't trust my dad anymore," I replied instead. He looked up. "Neither do I. I've stopped believing whatever the heck they say. Do you think we should ask them directly?" I nodded at the closed door. Edwin nodded. "I'll go ask my granddad. I think that's the easiest way." I thought my best bet was the basement, the same place Edwin had first found the letter. My granddad didn't look very healthy, and I was pretty sure he wouldn't be able to speak much. Edwin's granddad was in a similar state, but he wasn't as bad as mine. When Edwin found his way to Evan, I walked into the basement with the excuse that it needed cleaning. It was dusty, so it sounded reasonable to Evan. My granddad had been watching TV then and seemed a little happy that I was taking an initiative. It was a mess. When I walked down the basement, I wondered if it was really that serious. 3 hours in, and I was covered in heavy dust. The only good thing that came out of it was the notebook sitting in my open palm. It was small in size, but so many pictures and stamps were added to it that it looked thicker than it was. I put it in my back pocket and dragged myself out of there. As I bathed, I knew I was going to fall sick. When Edwin woke me up the next time, I was running a fever. He touched my forehead and announced that I was still warm. He had brought a bowl of soup for me. "Gotta get something in ya," he muttered and helped me sit up against the headboard. When I asked about our granddads, he shook his head. "I'm worried they don't have much time," he replied. I called my parents and updated them. My mom promised she'd come soon, so I'm expecting them in 2 days. I suggest you call your parents too. Your granddad's faring worse. I promised I'd call him before going to sleep later this evening. "I found this," I said, and dropped the little notebook in his hand. It was a notepad, basically, and when Edwin opened it, he found several small pictures of our granddad in it. Several pages had dates on them, and most of them belonged to the 40s and 50s. They were younger then, and thus they looked livelier than they looked now. Can't believe they used to do shit like this. I pointed at the hearts at the corner of one of the pictures. It definitely belonged to Evan because a lot of the single photos were my granddad's, and each of them was surrounded by little heart doodles. It was sweet in a way I didn't think my granddad's were. Edwin pointed at the date on the last page. It was a torn picture of my granddad in a tuxedo. "From the wedding?" I asked. Edwin nodded. "Probably when your grandparents married. So they already knew each other by the time they married our grannies." "They already loved each other," Edwin corrected. "Then why the heck did they marry our grannies?" "I suppose because gay marriage wasn't legal then? But that's still cruel." I must have sounded too excited and passionate. Edwin pressed a hand on my forehead and asked me to rest. He said that he'd found something as well, but wouldn't tell me unless I was well. I took the hint and fell asleep in the next half an hour. In the evening, I called my dad and informed him about the current state of my granddad. "He's not well, Dad," I said, a sob stuck somewhere in my throat. "The doctor came to take a look at him and he said he's not going to live long. He can't breathe properly, Dad. Please hurry." After a brief silence, he answered, "This is what they get for staying together and hurting your Nana, Anthony. You wait a little and the other guy will drop dead too." The words were cruel, and I could no longer understand this hatred for my granddad. Not at this stage. It wasn't like my granddad had killed her with his own damn hands. "He might as well have," my dad answered. A few days later, my granddad mentioned that he'd sent a lot of letters to your grandpa in the 60s, but he never received them. Either the address was incorrect or your grandpa never dared to bring them home. "So, where are they?" I asked. We were seated in one of the spots we'd located in one of the pictures. It was early morning, and Edwin and I had done our part of the morning. Our parents were here, and the tension was higher than it was in the past few weeks. If it made sense, in a way I believed the arrival of our parents was only going to make things worse for our granddads. It was often that Edwin and I heard our parents screeching at them. Each time, either we'd stand in the corner or ask them to shut it. It often worked, and it often didn't. "He has some of them now. They belong to the 60s, he said. So I'm assuming your granddad didn't reply because he was already married and had a child, your dad, with your Nana. What about yours? Wasn't yours married too?" Edwin nodded. "He was, but he didn't stay too long. If my parents haven't lied about this fact too, then he left my Nana when my dad was only 6 years old, for your granddad." "That sounds so fucking wrong," I exclaimed. "It does. Even as lovers, that sounds like a horrible thing to do. I think my granddad was less faithful than yours." He grinned down at me. I didn't say anything, mostly because I wasn't sure what I should. "But if your granddad was actually that faithful," he muttered, "then he wouldn't have left your Nana to die alone." That was one of the things we couldn't understand. Why did he leave her when she was dying? "I asked him about the kid thing," Edwin said. "He told me they were planning to adopt one after our dads cut all ties with them, but the laws didn't give them the right to. So if they could, they were ready to start a new family?" I scoffed. "Right after our grannies died," he added with a furrow in his brows. I swallowed and held his hand when we were coming down the hill. The moment we stepped out of there, I realized how nice it must have felt all those decades back. In the pictures, it looked like our granddads spent a lot of their time on this very hill. While you were sick, I contacted the local post office. I wondered if I could find any traces of all those old letters. I couldn't, but then I found this man. He was in his 50s, I think. He works in the post office. We can go see him even now." He stopped as if to think. Anyway, he asked what I was doing at the post office, and I replied that I was in search of some letters from the 60s. Anthony, he had the letters. Hundreds of unsent letters. But he said he'd bought them, so he didn't give me any. I took pictures of some of them. Sorry for the quality. He gave me a small smile. There were 7 letters he'd found. 5 of them dated from the early 60s to the late 60s. The rest of them were from the late 50s, surely around the time they were trying to separate from each other. These letters were desperate, not in an erotic kind of way, but in a longing kind of way. They must have been in their 30s. They'd married our grannies around that age. We couldn't understand most of the words, given the quality of the pictures, but some details were more than obvious. Several times it had mentioned, "I'm happy for your wife. She's luckier than I am." Edwin was standing behind me as I read through the letters, and each time I read aloud a particularly interesting sentence, he huffed out a breath. Each time it hit my bare neck. A warm feeling seemed to engulf me the more we stayed close, and it didn't help that many of the details in the letters mentioned the same things I had been feeling for Edwin. "Can you stop doing it?" I asked, my cheeks red. "What?" he asked. I glared over my back and he grinned. When I was done with the last letter, he dropped a quick kiss on my neck and ran away before I could catch up to him. "It's just funny," he said, laughing. "God, you're always blushing." I was blushing, and I would have thrown my phone at him if my mom hadn't been calling. When I picked up her call, her voice sounded grave. "Anthony," she began, "your granddad's dead. Adam's dead. He died in his sleep. Please come quickly." I stopped in my tracks and the laugh died down on my lips. When Edwin came asking what had happened, I broke down into tears. When he hugged me, I hugged him back. Some time later, "I don't suppose Anna was any luckier than I am," Evan was saying, his back to all of us. It had been a few days since we buried my granddad, and things at home had been gloomy as hell. Although my dad often threw some snarky and mean comments, it was obvious his dad's death had affected him. I often saw him sitting in front of the window and overlooking the big garden my granddad and Evan had managed to maintain in all these years. It was obvious that the guilt was weighing heavy on his shoulders. "Adam loved me till his last breath. I don't suppose anyone was as lucky as I am." "You kept him to yourself. What do you expect?" It was my dad. He often said bad things to protect his feelings. It was a toxic trait he had learned from his friends, something that he couldn't move past. Before he had come here, I'd asked him why he hated my granddad so much. I'd expected him to say for his mom, but he replied with, "He married a man, Anthony. It's disgusting. I've always been ashamed of that." Did he know his own son was gay and ready to mingle with Edwin the moment he got the chance? I wondered what his reaction would be. I wondered how Edwin would react if he found out I loved him. "We called you again and again, and you never came," Evan replied. "You made him gay," my dad replied. My mom tried to shush him, but he didn't shut up. "You killed my mom, and you made him gay. I was only a kid when he left. He was born gay, John. When will you accept that? He was born a moron. That was it." His words were muttered in a scoff. "John," my mom replied, horrified. She hated it when my dad cursed like a sailor. Edwin was holding my hand and we were standing in the corner, once again silent. When Evan turned around, his eyes were red. "How can you still be so hateful, John? Adam's dead." My dad was silenced, and he leaned against the couch, his voice tinier now. "You killed him." Evan didn't reply anything to that. "He loved you, you know. Even after everything you said and did, he still loved you, John. Forgive him for what happened in the past, John." "Please, Dad, shut up." This time it was Edwin's dad. When Edwin and I realized things were only going to get worse from here, Edwin loudly cleared his throat. "Can we all shut up for once? It's time for his medicine." The room was draped with so much tension that I was sure I could cut it with a knife. I stood a little closer to Edwin and my dad's eyes immediately fell on our joined hands. He glared at us. "Drop his hand, Anthony. What the heck is that?" I removed my hand from Edwin's hold immediately and crossed my hands behind my back. I kept my eyes low. Oh, he was so going to hate finding out his son is gay. For whatever insane reason, I wanted to giggle at that thought. Evan stood up and walked towards us. "Thank you, kids. Help me upstairs, will you?" We did. When we reached Evan's bedroom, Edwin asked why they'd hurt our grannies. "I understand you two loved each other. In fact, I know you guys loved each other for decades at that point, but why did you two cheat on them?" "Oh, child," he muttered and swallowed his medicine. He pointed at the bedside table and asked Edwin to grab a thick wad of folder from there. Edwin did. "I don't know where you've got all your ideas from, although some are correct, but that is the truth, child." He pointed at the folder. "That's a lot," I muttered. "That's history, Anthony," Evan agreed. He lied down on the bed. "When I say it feels empty without him, I mean it. It's been way too silent the past few days." "I'm sorry," Edwin muttered. Evan smiled at him. Before we could leave, he asked Edwin to stay back for a while. I walked away, a little awkwardly, and closed the door after myself. I was dying to see what was in the folder. When Edwin returned 5 minutes later, I saw him shuffling with the folder and putting away a paper in his pocket. Before I could ask him what it was, he dropped the file on the bed and looked at me. "So much to do," he said. I agreed. Along with the letters dated back to the 1940s, there was a diary and tens of pictures. I picked up the diary and was surprised to find that it belonged to my Nana. As I flipped through the pages, I realized she had started writing in 1963, probably after her marriage to my granddad. I kept flipping and stopped at a particular point. 2 pages were torn. The year, I assumed, was probably 1973. "Why would someone tear it?" Edwin asked. We can ask your granddad. We decided to ask him in the evening after he'd woken up from his nap. But before we could do so, he had died in his sleep, just like my granddad. All we had left were the things Edwin's granddad had left for us. Trusting our parents didn't really seem like an option, not after they'd lied so much to us. A few days later, as Edwin and I sat down with my Nana's diary in my hands, I couldn't help but rub my finger over the pages. "What happened in 1973? I muttered. "Something important?" Edwin asked and looked at me. I couldn't help but snap it close and look at him. "How will we find out? I don't want to have bitter feelings for my granddad for the rest of my life." "Neither do I," Edwin agreed and held my hand when it started trembling. To be continued. What do you think really happened between Adam, Evan, and their wives in the 70s? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force and to stay wholesome.